All right, so our story this week, we're going to be looking at the Tower of Babel, which is in Genesis 11, 1 to 9, if you want to open up, and I'm going to read it aloud. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city there before it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. You know, I've heard this story plenty of times over the years, beginning when I was just a child. It always sounded like something far off, from long ago. Yet when I read it now, it feels much more contemporary and descriptive of the world we live in. It's a story full of great anxieties, ambitions, and projects that ends with people confused and scattered. I think it serves as an important cautionary tale for our own longing for greatness that often sets aside God's plans. The story begins with a settling from the east, it says, as a subtle reference to the ancient world being filled again following the flood. The Shinar Plain is the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River, which is incredibly fertile land, and the region that will go on later to house the empires of Babylon and Assyria. And in many ways, Babel is a precursor and portrait of those empires, as they would be built and rebuilt again and again over about 2,000 years. And the city and the tower is what we know as a ziggurat, a stair-step-like pyramid that reaches up to the sky, which had a shrine on the top for worship. In fact, the later myth of Babylon was they had built such a wonderful tower that the god Marduk came to dwell at the top. And the name Babylon actually means gate of God. It was known as a city whose brick was most ancient, which echoes the details of the story here. This context already begins to inform the framework for this story as one guided by imperialistic ambitions that are contrary to God's plans. You see, earlier in Genesis, in Eden, God had commissioned humanity to multiply and fill the earth. But the story here, even as it spins an idealistic and collaborating vision of greatness, actually works in the opposite direction. Rather than filling the earth, verse 4 mentions specifically an anxiety about being scattered and dispersed. This is the very reason for building the tower. It's a contrast to God's plan, though. They have a great idea of their own. They say, "Come, let us make a name for ourselves." Their desire is to make themselves great, to preserve uniformity, but at what cost? I can't help but wonder what kind of social stratification might have accompanied such a project. Later in the Exodus story, brick building was an example of the harsh forced labor placed upon people. There's only so much room at the top of that pyramid. After all, empires have long sought to impose cultural homogeneity as part of their great plans. Might that also be at work here? And what about God? Well, it doesn't work out. In verse 5, we have the Lord come down to see what mortals have built. Mortals here meaning those who are not gods, which is an affront to their divine aspirations. While they are going up, God is coming down. Where the first half of the story describes human activity, the second half of the story actually describes God's response, which is an echoing of their very words. And it all hinges on this movement in the opposite direction. And God sees that they are one people with one language, just as stated at the outset of the story. Come, let us go down and confuse, God says, mirroring their own ideas, and ultimately bringing about the very conclusion they sought to avoid, as they are ultimately scattered and confused. Scattered and confused. Have you ever felt that way? When all the ideas and plans just seem to come to a halt, it's probably appropriate to ask in such moments if we might have lost sight of something of God's purposes, and we're instead building our own tower to the skies. But one simple message that I see here is that there is simply no thwarting God's plan. And while this may be an ancient story, it's one that just repeats still today. We live in an age of growth and expansion, of advanced technologies, where billionaires are blasting themselves off into space, and world leaders continue to plant their flags in new places, not their own, as they seek to expand their borders, as they build golden statues and rewrite maps. As we seek to make ourselves great and preserve and even spread our uniformity, we forget God's plans and our own mortality. As we build towers through our careers and businesses, buildings, branding, property, even our nation, as we seek to ascend the ladder, we instead find that God descends and works in the opposite direction. This story is a counter-narrative to the propagandas, the imperial agendas that overlook and abuse, and instead calls us to remember God's life-cultivating creativity and our God-glorifying purposes. You see, Babel will always be an unfinished project, as it is in this story, because it never works. The tower will never reach high enough, because we weren't meant for such of a project on our own. Yet it will get rebuilt again and again with the next politician, even the next pastor, so long as we forget God. But rather than trying to reach the heavens, what if we could remember that God is already here? We just need to look around to see how God is already working and building something all around us. You see, God has indeed come down into a messed up, megalomaniacal world of raging egos, and not just to be around us, but to live within us. In the very next stories of Genesis, we see in the story of Abraham that it is God who appears to him, not the other way around. He doesn't ascend to God. And one day, Jacob, one of his grandkids, would even have a vision of a ladder that already exists with angels ascending and descending. It's already there. God doesn't need us to build a staircase. And then one day, God went so far as to even become human, in order to build in us his own building, his own dwelling, a living temple, united, not in uniformity, but in a wonderful diversity that exemplifies his incredible imagination. In the words of Psalm 18, "You have stooped down to make me great. Or in the words of Jesus, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So what towers are you building? How have you lost sight of God's purposes and plans as you've pursued your own agenda? What tools might you need to lay down? And how might God be inviting you to join him in moving in the opposite direction? As we close, I ask you to consider these questions as we view together this ancient painting of the Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel the Elder.